Hello, my name is Rob Simpson and welcome to Directors Uncut. If this is your first episode, we put filmmakers from all corners of the globe onto a huge list that covers everything from psychedelic animation to fly-on-the-wall documentaries. Then we turn it into a lottery of directors by using a random number generator to pick a name out of the hat, whatever name comes out. I'm joined by a rotating cast of guest hosts to discuss them and their work through 2 films. Today, being joined by Gav of My Favourite Film podcast, who's making his first appearance since Wes Craven Part 2.
Wow, that sounds like a long time ago. Was it that far ago?
It was, yeah. We talked about Scream and New Nightmare on that one.
That's right, yes. The
classic 2 episode.
Yeah, good films.
Yeah, yes. And also joining us from Invasion of the Pody People and, well, we're both lecturers today, and writer for hire, it's Vincent. Hello there.
Here's Vinny! Indeed, coming in loud and clear here on Directors Uncut, making I believe my first appearance actually talking about a director. So it's a lovely place to start.
Yes, it's the Part 2 of Stanley Kubrick last week, or a fortnight ago, I should say, or 2 weeks ago. I don't know if that's a phrase that travels internationally. You know how it is. Americans don't have the same terms that we do, and Americans have my biggest listenership, so I've got a case to.
Absolutely.
So 2 weeks ago, we did Clockwork Orange and Barry Lyndon from Stanley Kubrick's illustrious filmography. This time, I guess it's the big hitters. It's most high profile, at least. We have 2001: A Space Odyssey from 1968 and The Shining from 1980. So, I'm not sure how different an answer I'm going to get here, but I'll ask it anyway. The first time you were aware of Stanley Kubrick, this is what we want to know now. Gav, yourself, when was he on there? When did he pop up? I don't know how to word this. It's really awkward phrasing.
He was just there. He just appeared one morning. No, I don't know when the first time I was aware of Stanley Kubrick. I probably was aware of his films without being aware of him as a director. I'd certainly seen 2001 and never thought, that's, this is Stanley Kubrick, this is some massive director of some sort. I'd enjoyed the film. And many of his other films, including The Shining. And never really put this thing into my head that Stanley Kubrick is some fantastic director that does lots and lots of things. Just, I've seen some films that he's made. So I think he's always been around in that sphere of films that I've watched. So, yeah, just one of those ones, I suppose. It's a weird one, I suppose, because he has made so many different films of so many different genres. And they're all slightly different. So, there is a Kubrickian style, I think the class it has, but a lot of his films you can't quite tell.
He's going to be one of those directors like your Hitchcocks or your Spielbergs. He's just sort of present.
Yeah, I guess he's been omnipresent in my life for most of the films I've watched.
Same question to yourself, Vincent.
Well, it is interesting to note that, yes, Kubrick's legacy, influence, and so on is extensive, which is kind of surprising when you consider he only made 13 feature films. I became aware of him in the late 90s, which was and I suppose it's significant, that was also part of when I was becoming properly aware of film as a medium, as an art form, and realizing just the sort of things you could do with it. And by that point, I knew you could study it at university, and that was a delight to discover. Weirdly, I think the point at which Kubrick became most prominent in my awareness, the point when I certainly was aware of him as a presence, was round about the time he died, because I had a housemate in the summer of '99 who was a big Kubrick fan, and I remember going with him and a few others to watch The Shining. Wasn't the first time I'd seen it, but I think it was the first time I saw it as a Stanley Kubrick film. And I had read a lot about the production of Eyes Wide Shut. And when the trailer of that was going, I was doing the rounds and it was saying Cruise, Kidman, Kubrick. I think it might have been the first time I saw that. I was like, Kubrick being... Oh, right, that's the director. Okay. So I guess fairly late in the day. And yeah, that was, The Shining was, I think, the first Kubrick film I saw. And I saw that sometime in the mid-90s, watched on TV, pretty sure with my mum, and then watched The Shining a few more times since then, and discovered the rest of Kubrick's oeuvre. I don't think I saw Eyes Wide Shut until maybe a decade or so after its release. I think that's when I became aware of Kubrick, round about the time he died.
It's sad how consistent a thing that is with a lot of artists from past generations. You learn about them as they die. But for me anyway, I found it as a startling and horrible fact of discovering people when they pass away either too soon or whatever their circumstances may be.
Yeah.
Although I will say, I know that the very first Kubrick film I saw, not knowing who he was Spartacus, which I watched at school, or at least some of it, when our topic for that term was the Romans. So, hey, here's a movie with Romans.
That's the same for me, really.
Yeah.
I've seen it with my dad, but as far as knowing him, Eyes Wide Shut maybe, but when he died, definitely, unfortunately. Not to break up this episode or anything.
Yeah, I've kind of already done that. Yeah, well done.
Well, we begin at the end and work our way back.
Yeah.
So we have two movies, 1968, 2001, and The Shining. So where do we want to start in this week's episode?
Wow.
Well, shall we go chronologically?
It sounds like a good start, yeah.
Yes, so following 1964's Doctor Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb, nobody ever knows the full title, it's just Doctor Strangelove. Yeah. He followed it up with this wild adaptation of an Arthur C. Clarke novel.
Not an adaptation, no.
Well, not adaptation, he wrote it with.
Yeah.
Correct.
At the same time as the book, yeah.
It is something of a unique production context in that you've got the novel and the film being produced at the same time.
Do you read me, Hal? Hello, Hal, do you read me? Hello, Hal, do you read me? Do you read me, Hal?
Affirmative, Dave. I read you.
Open the pod bay doors, Hal.
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that.
What's the problem?
I think you know what the problem is just as well as I do.
What are you talking about, Hal?
This mission is too important for me to allow you to jeopardize it.
I don't know what you're talking about, Hal.
I know that you and Frank were planning to disconnect me. And I'm afraid that's something I cannot allow to happen.
Where the hell did you get that idea, Hal?
Dave, although you took very thorough precautions in the pod against my hearing you, I could see your lips move.
Well, actually, in terms of summarizing the plot of 2001: A Space Odyssey, it's easy because you could write the plot on the back of a postage stamp. Dawn of humanity to birth of a new species. That is the plot. If you want a bit more detail, we begin with the dawn of humanity when a group of pre-human apes discover a monolith, which teaches them how to, essentially how to use tools, how to use weapons, and how to kill. Then we jump forwards in possibly the greatest match cut in the history of cinema to the year 2001, more or less. We jump forwards to a point when another monolith has been discovered on the moon. We follow a professor, Dr. Hayward Floyd, who makes his way from Earth to the moon and to inspect this monolith. The monolith then emits a signal which prompts a mission to Jupiter. So a huge spacecraft called Discovery sets off from Earth, and we pick that up 18 months into its journey. And the two astronauts aboard, Dave Bowman and Frank Poole, have to contend with the computer on board the ship, HAL. And then, at the end of that, the survivor, Bowman, encounters the monolith and is seemingly transformed into a new species. And it's worth mentioning, I think, that the monoliths appear to be a relic from an extraterrestrial intelligence, but tellingly, that is the only extent of that intelligence that we see. So there we are. That is the plot of 2001: A Space Odyssey. It's a simple plot, but it is anything but a simple film.
Okay, so Gav, what are you thinking of this one? What's your feelings on 2001?
Do you know what? It's one of those films that if you've only seen it once, you haven't seen it. You've got to watch this film a couple of times at least. But I mean, as Vincent said, there's 4 stories here effectively, and they are all cut together. You get a little title before each one to say this is the first story, this next story, and so on as you go through. The 4th story being very linked, more linked than any of the others to the 3rd story. I think the other 2 then are very different. I think it's a film you've certainly got to think about watching, because I think it's 15 minutes before anyone speaks in the film, because you've got that whole section at the start where it's the apes and they're just grunting at you for quite a long time, which takes, certainly on a first viewing, which I watched this, I'm trying to think when I actually first saw 2001. I watched it because I was a huge fan of science fiction as a kid. So what would have been I probably watched it far too young, apart from anything else.
Yes.
I probably watched it in the sort of early 80s, where I would have been just hitting 10-year-old. Probably didn't really understand what was going on particularly. But you have to really, really concentrate on that first part just to get through it. And it is almost to a certain extent a get through that first part, because there's not an awful lot going to happen.
I absolutely agree with what you said there, Gav. It is a film that, A, you have to see multiple times, and B, rewards multiple viewings. You keep watching it, and I think it is this is why I consider it, among my personal favourite films ever, because it is one that I can keep going back to and finding something new. I say facetiously that I think 2001: A Space Odyssey is the greatest film of all time. This is facetious and absurd because I have not seen every film that's ever been made. So more seriously, I will say that, in all seriousness, I do consider 2001: A Space Odyssey to be the single most impressive work of cinema I have ever seen. And one of the key reasons for that is that is related to what you were saying, Gav, that you go back to it multiple times and you keep finding new material. But also, I think it's important to note you have to watch it very, I think, acutely. You have to watch it very carefully. And one of the reasons for that is that it works on a level of pure cinema. As we've said, the story is very simple. It's not a movie where you have to think about the narrative, but you do have to think about the way, but also feel the way it is communicating with you through visual and aural cinematic language.
Yes.
That's sort of my overall feeling about the film. What about you, Rob?
This is my first watch, I'll be honest.
Really?
Wow. Yes. It is one of the sort of the big, I really need to have seen this before, but it just kind of evaded me. I'm the same with Lawrence of Arabia. It's just one of those big titans, those big tentpole movies that I never got around to. And I'm not sure, honestly. It doesn't really invent sci-fi. I think it recycles a lot of the things which were done in a Czech movie from 1963 called Ikari XB1, but this does it on a scale which is impossible for anything other than a director like Kubrick to do. But I think it's to do a disservice to watch it on a TV.
Yeah.
And it's just an art piece as far as my first sort of reception of it, because the story is so abstract and non-linear and slight that at first viewing it's just sort of a sensory piece, a visual piece, an art piece with some great sets, some great iconic visuals which sort of define the art form. But for me, it's just finding that connection, and I don't think you can do it on one viewing.
Yeah,
I had I had an interesting series of experiences with this movie, because I've seen it like 4 or 5 times very specifically at the Art Cinema in Norwich, and the first 3 or 4 times I saw it, it was with an introduction, once by a local science fiction author, and several times by one of the world leading scholars on Stanley Kubrick, who's a film studies lecturer called Peter Kramer, who's published a book on Kubrick on 2001 and on Dr. Strangelove and A Clockwork Orange. So he does all the stuff. And one of the notable things is, and because of these multiple viewings with these very erudite introductions that were then followed often by Q&As, I felt that 2001 was a film that had to be seen in a certain way. It had to be seen in a cinema. And for a while, I decided to myself, I'm not going to watch this film on TV. I only want to see it in a cinema. However, I then did watch it on DVD on a decent sized TV, I will say, though not a huge one. And it still worked. It still felt like what I would call a transportive experience. And so just to continue the thread of how it was being used, the reason I watched it that time was because it was actually part of a module I was teaching, and the class that I had relating to it was one of the best teaching experiences I've ever had. It was the kind of class where I had to actually cut the students off to say, sorry guys, loving the discussion, but someone else needs to use this room. And I don't know, one thing I don't know about the students who had seen it, who came into the class to talk about it, I don't know if it was for them, their first viewing, because they would have been like, a generation younger than me. But yeah, so maybe it was for them a first viewing. And they certainly managed to get a lot out of it on that, granted seeing it in an academic context. But what was brilliant about that particular discussion, and indeed every discussion I've had about it is something that says so many things to so many others. And we can talk, of course, about the film's original reception and the reputation that it's grown since then.
Yeah, I mean, you were saying about being an art form and being something that's a visual feast and whatever else. I mean, the first re-showing or the first showings of this, there was a lot of people in the 60s that were going in to watch this for an LSD trip. The whole section where they go into the star at the end, watching that on drugs apparently is fantastic. I've never done it myself, but apparently it really, really works. And there's obviously the whole thing with the Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon, that apparently if you watch the whole film with Dark Side of the Moon playing as well, it fits perfectly well with all the visuals that you're watching. So I don't know how well that works. I've never tried it, but it's available. You can get it on YouTube. There's full high-quality versions of it are there with Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon playing in the background rather than the normal soundtrack, and apparently it fits perfectly with all of the visuals and things that Kubrick made. Don't know why, but it does.
Yeah. It's I think you have to talk about Doug Trump. I think I've got the name right there. It is Doug Trumbull, isn't it? The director of I forgot what it's called now.
Silent Running.
Yes, it's just on the tip of my tongue. Director of Silent Running. He did a lot of the miniature work and practical effects and sets and bits and pieces on this. And it's, considering it's 1968.
Yeah.
I don't know when the origin of Star Trek would be.
2 years prior.
Yeah.
Even so, Star Trek wouldn't do anything this accomplished until at least the late 90s, and nothing in sci-fi would really touch this. Maybe Alien is comparable in its scale and its ships. Star Wars, maybe, but we're talking about a very, very elite group of science fiction classics that attain the look of this. And the bonus here is this was inventing this style and on this scale, I should say.
What it's worth noting about is it's fascinating to know the sort of part of the production initial process, because after success of Dr. Strangelove, and yes, there had been science fiction previously that was largely associated in film with the 50s B movies, and Kubrick contacted Arthur C. Clarke and the letters between them talk about wanting to make a definitive science fiction film, and to go in, and because Kubrick had a certain amount of success, he was able to get a lot of support from MGM, get a major budget for the film, and put together something that it did make a major transition in the genre, because it was, if not necessarily the first, certainly the first significant mainstream, big budget science fiction film made with the sort of care that we've been talking about. And because it was a major success, both commercially and also sort of culturally, it ended up being, generating a great deal of popular support. It's easy to therefore see why it went on to be an influence on so many other science fictions. I mean, if we think about science fiction films, like talking about just the following decade, we get Star Wars, we get Close Encounters of the Third Kind, we get Alien, and I think it's worth saying we also get Star Trek: The Motion Picture, which I think the influence of the Star Trek: The Motion Picture owes a lot more to 2001 than it does to Star Wars, even though it was only came about because of the success of Star Wars. And you can find the influence of 2001 across, I think, in the entirety of science fiction cinema, and indeed upon the influence, and it's a major influence upon so many prominent filmmakers: Steven Spielberg, George Lucas, James Cameron, Christopher Nolan. All of them cite Kubrick in general and 2001 in particular as a major influence. And I think a key part of that is exactly what you guys mentioned about the meticulousness of the detail. In 1968, imagining that this is what space travel would have looked like in 2001, those who lived to 2001 probably were very disappointed. Like, ow! But I'll tell you what, you could release that movie now, call it 3001: Space Odyssey or 2051: A Space Odyssey, and I think it would still work. You'd still get viewers going, "Oh yeah, that makes sense. I can imagine space travel being like that." Yeah, it all feels plausible. It all feels lived in. It is science fiction done with emphasis upon the science.
Yeah.
Yeah, and consider that at this time, prior to this time, it was a lot of sci-fi was metaphors for the red menace of communism.
Absolutely, yeah.
This is, I don't think that reading can be, I mean, if you look for it, it is a movie where if you bring your own meaning, you can find it. But I think that's one that's maybe a little bit too much mental gymnastics to find that one in 2001. Maybe. But,
well, except to mention that we do see Russians in the film when Dr. Floyd arrives at the orbiting station. He encounters some Russians, and it's fairly cordial, although at the same time, only so far. And of course, coming after Dr. Strangelove, which, spoiler alert, it does end with the end of the world, with a nuclear holocaust. So 2001 has often been read as being sort of the hopeful alternative to what the future may hold in that regard.
Yeah.
But yeah, go on, Rob. What put you off?
It's one of these movies that has been copied and replicated and homaged so much. I can't remember the name. I think it was The Graduate. I remember seeing The Graduate eventually, and it felt like I'd seen it before, even though I hadn't, because it had been imitated and replicated and copied and mocked in so many things. It kind of really weird experience, I'll tell you, watching a movie you've never seen before, but you've seen all of its big hit moments. 2001's exactly the same. It's probably the most parodied movie of all time, I go as far to say. Visually, especially the HAL sequence. Maybe even the opening part with the apes is really heavily parodied as well.
I'll say that although I didn't see the movie for the first time until I think 2004, I had indeed seen various bits of it. And we'll come back to this, not least on The Simpsons, because there's an episode that is called Homer's Odyssey, where Homer's in space and he's floating around to the Blue Danube. There's also another episode where Homer's having a dream about being one of the apes encountering the monolith. And that sequence also gets parodied in Zoolander to, I think, quite hilarious effect. And of course, the number of places where the ubiquity of HAL, and you can even find, again, it crops up in other movies. Certainly the first time I saw Independence Day, I had no idea of the reference when Jeff Goldblum opens his computer and up comes the red eye and it says, "Hello, Dave." So yeah, it's everywhere.
Yeah, it's ubiquitous, really, in movies. It's amazing how I managed to avoid it for so long.
Yeah, but as you're saying, you've probably seen it used in so many different places anyway. It's a film that's certainly, I'm sure if Strauss had been alive at the time, he would have been quite happy with how his music's been used in this film and how it's been used since. I'm not even going to try and pronounce the name of the main theme because I can't pronounce foreign language very well. But, that main theme of the film is used in everything. Whenever you have any scene where you got to have suspense or something happen that's big and whatever, you get the duh noise that you still get the same in 2001. It's used everywhere to sort of symbolize space travel or alien invasion or whatever it happens to be. It's hit pop culture in that way.
It's called Thus Spake Zarathustra.
Well done.
By Strauss. And you're right, though. What's fascinating is that even though that's what it is called, it's Thus Spake Zarathustra. It is far better known in culture as it's that thing from 2001, which is remarkable when you consider that when pieces of music are often strongly associated with films, they tend to be those that were originally composed. Think of most of John Williams's career, or various scores of Hans Zimmer as well. But in the case of 2001, what's notable is that it did have an entire score composed, which was ready to go, and then Kubrick said, "Nah, I'm going to use a bunch of classical music instead." And you can get as was mentioned in the previous episode, you can get the unused soundtrack of 2001. It actually makes an appearance in A Clockwork Orange. But yeah, it's remarkable the reputation that the film has given to the music, and which I imagine one could say that the music kind of helped create the reputation of the film as well.
Definitely, yeah. I don't think it was so much that Kubrick decided not to use it. It was more that he was taking so long to compose it and get it out there that Kubrick needed a placeholder to put in place for the production company. So he used the Blue Danube over that scene where you have the match shot that you were talking about before, and he used the other stuff as well to just have some music behind the film. And the production company went, "This is better than anything else that's being done. Let's just use that. Can we get the rights to Strauss?" And obviously they managed it. So
that's hugely strange, because producers making a movie better is not a story which will go down in history in many occasions.
I think Kubrick chose the music.
But they're confirming it's okay.
Yeah.
Worth noting, though, that Kubrick himself was one of the producers, because after the experience he had on Spartacus, after his experience on Spartacus, he did declare he wasn't going to direct another film unless he could also produce it, which gave him a greater level of control, which we can see because of the very distinctive work he made over the next 4 decades.
Yeah, music is such a unique thing in his filmography. I was trying to think there are other examples of music which basically not surpass but define film, and the only example I could really think of the top of my head is from The Exorcist. Really, that little piece of music, whose name's just completely vanished. It had it in my head.
Tubular Bells.
Tubular Bells. There we go. Which was repurposed, but yes, this is a movie we could talk about for a very long time. So I think
perhaps if we just pick a few sort of key aspects of it that really stand out to us.
Yeah, I can start, no problem. I mean, the first scenes that certainly stick in my mind are always that the ape finally getting the knowledge that he needs in order to become something more. When he picks up that bone for the first time and starts, right, I can do something, I can start violence, I can do what I need to do. And it's symbolizing the whole violence of nature and humanity after that point. I think that's what the monolith is trying to do at that point, is to bring humanity to some sort of realization that they are the dominant creatures. Why? It's a different question. It's never really fully answered as to why the monolith is doing the things it does and why it's making people act the way they act. I think the whole section, and I've said this before and I've got in trouble for it, but the whole section on the moon is completely pointless. There's just that whole bit, even the apes to a certain extent, I get it, I understand it, but it's just a lot of sitting through. The whole story on the Discovery and the stuff with Hal, the going to Jupiter is much more interesting film. And it's a long time before you get to that part of the film. That's certainly, from first viewing and remembering the film, it's certainly the part of the film that I always remember is the stuff with Hal and the stuff on the spaceship. And then the weird artistic ending that it has that you kind of wonder whether or not Kubrick himself was on drugs at that point. But I've watched it multiple times. Unlike Rob, I have seen this a lot of times.
Don't need to shame me.
I felt it's necessary. I can't believe that you got this point in your life and only seen 2001 once. It's like, what? Especially because I bet you've seen The Ring about 50,000.
24.
But yeah, it's a really interesting film. Key points, like you said, that first bit with the monkey first picking up the bone is wonderful. I think the acting in those ape suits is amazing, especially when you consider that around about the same time we've got Planet of the Apes.
Same year.
Their apes, the same year, yeah. Their apes look a lot better, but these apes act more ape-like than the Planet of the Apes apes. But there's a lot that can be said about that. The moon section, I always just try and avoid it more than anything else. I watch it. There's some wonderful bits in it. The whole walking in zero gravity, the picking the pen up from the mid-air is brilliantly done. Again, they invented special effects for it. You know, it was like, we want a pen to float across the screen. How are we going to do that? So they stick a pen to a bit of glass and literally turned the glass round whilst they went across the screen, and then they pluck it off. If you watch very carefully, when she plucks the pen, you can see that she's having put some force to pluck the pen off the glass, rather than just take it from floating in space. The turning of the camera and all that type of thing to make it so people go upside down. It's amazing work, visually stunning. But everything after that on Discovery is just wonderful. All the stuff with Hal is amazing stuff. And I could watch that part of the film again and again and again. It's generally, if I'm going to rewatch it, I'll probably speed up the first 45 minutes and then just watch from that point. In fact, I think on a first viewing, you're probably better to speed up to that point. Otherwise, you will be bored by the first two parts. And Vincent's looking at me like, you are absolutely dissing my favorite film. But I think I'm right that if you're on your first viewing, skipping the monkeys and skipping the moon is probably a really good idea. Watch the Hal stuff, then go back to the monkeys and the moon stuff later. Go on, Vincent, I'll let you answer that one.
Well, I would disagree. I think that one of the reasons the section on Discovery works so well is that we have had this long build-up. And I think a key aspect of the film is that it's treating its, and this I think is something I think Kubrick always did, he's treating his audience with a great deal of respect to say, right, here's what I'm going to do. I'm laying out this simple story but very dense piece of cinema, and you've got to, and I'm not going to make it easy for you. You're going to have to be patient with it. And I think I take your point that the section, if you like, with Dr. Floyd isn't entirely relevant to the plot. However, it is important, I think, for context, for it's part of the world building. We have, as you say, Floyd approaching the space station aboard aboard Pan Am spacecraft, and then there's also, I think, an important part of the lunar module, as it were, coming down onto the moon base, and doing so in a way that, again, it's done slowly, meticulously, and it's a way of highlighting, yes, humanity has set things up on the moon. It's all very nice and civilized, while still also having a certain amount of adaptations, like the weightlessness and the weird food that they've got to eat in zero gravity and so on. Every time I watch this film, I do obviously find new things. What I'm going to focus on right now, particularly because it's what's standing out to me, is the kind of meta-cinematic qualities of it. The way the film uses the medium of cinema so exquisitely, and at times is also quite meta-cinematic. I mentioned it earlier, I'll detail it now. The greatest match cut in the history of cinema, when Moonwatcher, the kind of leader of the ape tribe, he throws a bone in the air, and then we cut from the image of the bone to an image of a satellite. And it is, for those out there who who aren't familiar with the term, a match cut is when you've got one shot and then you cut to another shot which is completely different, but has a graphic similarity. So in this case, an oblong shape in midair cut to a completely different object in a similar position. And thus we have a match cut which literally spans millions of years. But I also think it's interesting to think about it in relation to what's meta-cinematic. But I will just let Gav come in first.
I was just going to say, because everyone always goes on about this match cut being the greatest match cut in cinema history. It's not that great. Honestly, it doesn't match. It doesn't match. You have this bone that flies up to about there on the screen, and if you can't see where my finger is, obviously because you can't, the top quarter of the screen or the top third of the screen, the thing it's matching to is down the bottom right-hand corner of the screen. They don't match. And everyone says, great match cut. It's not. Highlander has a brilliant match cut in it, where you're under the water with Connor, and it flows up to the top of the water. And actually, you're not in the water at all. You're in the fish tank in Connor's room. That's a great match cut. That's a proper, really good match cut. From a filmatic point of view, Highlander in 2001 are poles apart. But from a match point of view, Highlander's match cut and the fish pond and the river is better than the match cut in 2001. And I will argue that till the day is long.
Well, go on. That could be a fun discussion. I mean, fair enough. I mean, let's say it's the most famous match cut in cinema history,
without doubt.
Yeah.
Although I will say, okay, but I will just counter what you said, Gav. That you're right. It's not a perfect match, but then it is continuing the motion. For the bone would have been coming down, and then we cut to the satellite in the equivalent position. So it might be more accurate to call it a near match cut. Anyway, throughout the film, we continue to get, I think, these incredible uses of cinema, and the Stargate sequence, I think, is one of the best demonstrations of that, because that is a point where narrative just is no longer really a concern, and what we're getting here is pure experience. It is putting forward this complete cinematic experience, which you can respond to in different ways. Yes, maybe one effective way to engage with it is to be under the influence of mind-altering drugs. Another valid response, I don't share it, but another response I've heard is that this is when it becomes not only very boring, but incredibly pretentious. And then there's my perspective, which is, okay, now you're genuinely transporting me, and this is something transcendent. But speaking again about the meta-cinema qualities, it's notable, I think, that when it's on its side, the monolith is reminiscent of a cinema screen. Think of the opening titles of the film. It starts with a black oblong screen because the structure of the film is not unlike that of a classical opera. So you have sort of the overture beforehand, and there's several minutes just of black screen with music playing. And if you think about it, what we then have in the opening sequence of The Dawn of Man, the apes encountering the monolith, again, are seeing this black oblong shape, and a peculiar sound is coming from it, and they're having a similar response. So I think we have a quality whereby the film is presenting its experience, the narrative experience, as a similar experience for the viewer. And then later on, we see when Bowman has got past is the sole survivor of the mission, and he encounters the monolith. Again, it is in a more oblong. It's obviously a black oblong. It's horizontal rather than vertical. And again, I think it's mimicking something of the cinema screen. And his journey through the Stargate, going through the monolith almost, as it were, it mirrors the experience of the viewer going into the film, and we are being transported just as he is. And this is what I think makes it, for my money, the most impressive piece of cinema there is, because it's taking us through, it's giving us the experience within the film. And this leads me to my response to one of the key criticisms of the film, which is, and I'd be interested to know your views on this. Now, one of the criticisms of the film is that criticism of Kubrick broadly is that his films tend to be quite cold. They're very intellectual, they're not very emotional. And that in the case of 2001, what we have is the most engaging character, most sympathetic character, is the computer. And that the human characters, there isn't much to engage with. Now, for my money, I think that's a great strength. Because there is not a great deal of character to engage with in the film, we, as the viewer, are required to engage ourselves into the world of the film. Therefore, we're not necessarily engaged with characters, but what we are engaged with, if we engage at all, which, maybe you don't, that's fair, is with the Odyssey. The film takes us on that Odyssey. we can be alongside there. We can see the inscrutable, impenetrable monolith and think it's telling me something important. Maybe it's telling me to pick up a bone and bash in the head of the person beside me in the cinema. Hopefully not. But it is communicating something to me. And best of all, of course, when we can go into the Stargate, we can go on that journey as well. So that's a perspective that I have on what could be argued is a weakness in the film. I think is a great strength, and I'd be interested to know what your views are.
I mean, I would agree with you that I actually love the ending of the film. Like I say, I think the first part, and I know I said in a kind of offhand kind of way that, you know, you can ignore the first part and not watch it start in the middle. But I think that is, for a first viewing, that is probably a really good way of doing it, because although there is a lot of context in it, as you said, it is a bit dull. But that end bit, I can understand as well, people saying it's pretentious, that it's art for art's sake. All of those things have been said. But I think it's brilliant. It's wonderfully put together, the whole way that Dave goes through the end of his life, that he sees in the distance himself. And then you become him watching himself. And then you're now inside, you're watching the old man that he was watching, or the slightly older man that he was watching. And you just keep moving through that space of time by becoming Dave at each next scene in his evolution, actually, isn't it? That's effectively what happens. He evolves to become the Star Child. I think the book puts it a lot better at the end and says, I kind of loops it back round to, I think, it's Moonwatcher, I think Arthur C. Clarke calls the ape at the start that has the bone. I don't think he's ever mentioned as that in the film, but it is Moonwatcher that he calls him. And it's Moonwatcher because at the end, Dave himself becomes the moon that is then watching the Earth. So there is kind of that link round that he becomes this Star Child that's effectively holding the future of humanity in his hands. And I can't see, actually, if you've read the book, I can't see how else you could film that sequence other than the way that Kubrick did it. And yes, it looks a bit pretentious on screen, but you know what? It's a brilliant way to end that whole story and bring it around. Go on, you can say.
Well, just quickly, it's worth noting that the first, in the novel, the first section, the Dawn of Man bit, ends with Moonwatcher saying he would think of something. And then the very final line of the book is the Star Child, and it is, he would think of something. So what's fascinating is that calling this an odyssey is about a journey to somewhere and then back home, which we do get in the case of Bowman, because we do end with him orbiting the Earth. And indeed, so it's like, well, what happens next is remains to be seen. And there's, in the novel, it's a bit more, it's much clearer, because you know, the Star Child causes all of the world's nuclear weapons to self-destruct. At least those orbiting the Earth, not necessarily destroying the Earth, but certainly taking out the nuclear arsenal. And then the film, of course, is steadfastly ambiguous.
As far as the ending, I think it's a matter of where your goalposts are. I know it's not relevant to 2001 in any way, but I remember reading the reviews and the critical reception of a little indie punk comedy called Dinner in America, where people said, "Oh, it's too aggressive. It's too aggressive." And I think in the case of both that and this, it's a matter of where your goalposts are, because I don't think it's aggressive or too arty. If you watch Peter Strickland movies, he's clearly very influenced by this. Peter Strickland, if you don't know his name, Barbarian Sound Studio, In Fabric, stuff like that. So I think it's sort of an escalation of a style and a conclusion of a style, and I don't really think you could end it any other way. It's such a flamboyant and large and extravagant movie. If you just ended it with some characters talking or whatever, I think it's kind of anticlimactic. It needs something big and loud and exuberant in its finish.
Yeah. And to have that as its finale, literally the birth of a new species, which then turns towards the camera and is effectively asking what happens now. Yeah, that's a big finish. I think you're absolutely right.
여하튼 요즘 이런 소문이 돌더라고.
그것을 누가 해준 얘긴데?
뱅규 형님.
아따 그 새끼 그 진짜 이제 너한테 가장 떠들어 쌌네. 이?
근데요, 이 소문을 들어본 게 그 양반이 무시 있긴 한갑지다네.
무엇이?
저기 다리끼에 가게 준 실성했지라. 방앗간 한없이 급사했지라.
Just taking a little break in the middle of the podcast here to, a little bit of housekeeping. But before I get into that, in the first half, in the bit where we're talking about 2001, you might have heard what sounds like sort of a rat chewing wires. I'm aware of that. In the recording, it was much, much worse. So that is the repaired version of what that audio was. So I apologise for that. But it's resolved. Very, very minimal in the second half compared to the first. Very, very minimal. But yeah, on the housekeeping, if you want to keep up with the show, social media is not as simple as it used to be, is it? Once upon a time, I would have said you can keep up to date with the podcast and all the things that I'm up to by following me on Twitter and Instagram at UncutRobcast. But even just 2 weeks. 2 weeks is such a wild time in the current world, really. So now you can also find me on Mastodon. If you search for Uncut Robcast, I think I'm on the BBQ Snoot server. And just the fact that I just think I'm on that server, I'm not sure, is the reason why I don't think that's going to take off in the way that people hope it will. Hive Social is the other one that I've just joined. You can find me Uncut Robcast on there too. So I'm not going to join anymore because honestly it's a mess, and I'm not joining a new one every week. We'll see where things lie really in a few weeks, few months time. But yeah, those are the ones for now. If you like the show and you're enjoying it, subscribe. Find whatever podcast provider you're on, please do give us a rating. If it's Apple Podcasts, give us a rating and a review. That does help with positivity. Please do help get rid of that 1-star review that I've got on the American Star. Whoever did that, you suck. Or if you're listening on Spotify, which is the giant most popular place to listen to, please give us a rating there too, because it does help with the visibility, and visibility is very, very important on podcasts. Otherwise, check out our sister podcast, Pop Screen. I do appear on that quite regularly. And Graham, who is on the next episode, is the lead of Pop Screen. So check out his podcast. Check out thegeekshow.co.uk. Loads of articles going on. I'm the editor over there. So please do check that out for the reviews and everything else that's happening over there. But yeah, I think that's about it really to mention. Other than next week's episode, or in the fortnight, 2 weeks episode, is Na Hong Jin, and we're doing The Chaser and The Wailing, which would be a great episode. The Wailing's one of my favourite horror movies, so that's one to look forward to. But yeah, that covers it, I think. So we'll jump into a clip from The Shining now, and we'll return with Gav and Vincent talking about that horror icon, that horror classic.
You think maybe he should be taken to a doctor? When do you think maybe he should be taken to a doctor?
As soon as possible. As soon as possible. Jack.
You believe his health might be at stake?
Yes.
You are concerned about him.
Yes.
And are you concerned about me?
Of course I am.
Of course you are. Have you ever thought about my responsibilities?
Oh, Dick, what are you talking about?
Have you ever had a single moment's thought about my responsibilities? Have you ever thought for a single solitary moment about my responsibilities to my employers? Has it ever occurred to you that I have agreed to look after the Overlook Hotel until May the 1st? Does it matter to you at all that the owners have placed their complete confidence and trust in me, and that I have signed a letter of agreement, a contract, in which I have accepted that responsibility? Do you have the slightest idea what a moral and ethical principle is, do you? Has it ever occurred to you what would happen to my future if I were to fail to live up to my responsibilities? Has it ever occurred to you? Has it?
Stay away from me.
Why?
I just want to go back to my room.
Why?
I'm very confused. minutes to think things over.
You've had your whole fucking life to think things over. What good's a few minutes more gonna do you now?
Stay away from me. Please. Don't hurt me.
I'm not gonna hurt you.
Stay away from me.
Wendy.
Stay away.
Darling, light of my life. I'm not gonna hurt you. You didn't let me finish my sentence. I said, I'm not gonna hurt you. I'm just gonna bash your brains in. I'm gonna bash them right the fuck in.
Stay away from me. Don't hurt me.
I'm not gonna hurt you.
Stay away from me. Stay away. Please.
So that leads us to part 2 of the podcast, in which we, in this case, are going to be talking about 1980s The Shining and Stephen King's favourite movie. Yes. Based on an adaptation of one of his books.
Should we get that out of the way first? The King background. Yeah. Actually, it's worth noting, of course, both of these films have a connection to novels. 2001 being written at the same time. In this case, the novel written, then adapted. Have either of you read the novel?
I've not read any Stephen King, funnily enough.
Yeah, I've read The Shining, yeah.
Interesting thing, because I saw The Shining multiple times and I only read the novel a few years ago. And what's interesting is, I thought it was great. I found it very engaging. And I think it is the only novel I've read that gave me a nightmare.
Wow.
Which, interestingly, the film didn't do. I can't, I'd be hard-pressed to think of movies that I would think, oh, that inspired that particular dream or nightmare. But in the case of The Shining, it's like, oh, that's interesting. I read The Shining, and then not long afterwards, I had a dream about ferocious hedge animals. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
But yes, let's get it out of the way. Stephen King, famously not a fan of Stanley Kubrick's adaptation of The Shining, to such an extent that in the late 90s, he did his own TV adaptation, a 2-part miniseries of The Shining, which is unsurprisingly adheres more closely to the novel, since King was far more involved, and is largely forgotten.
Fairness, King doesn't like any film that's adapted from his books unless he's got some sort of involvement in it. And generally when he has involvement in it, the films tend to be stinkers. He seems to be able to ruin his own works by bringing it to film. When someone else does an adaptation with him not involved, it's a lot better.
I would say Doctor Strange is... No, that's not the right one, is it? It's... what was it called? It's the sequel list, Dr. Sleep.
Dr. Sleep,
yeah.
That was an exception to the rule, because I do think that's an interesting sequel to this. But it doesn't need a sequel, I'll be honest.
You could argue, though, that Dr. Sleep is very much a sequel more to Kubrick's film than to King's book.
It's a weird status it lends, isn't it?
Yeah.
But anyway, to The Shining.
Yes, The Shining.
The Shining, a 1980 movie. It stars Jack Nicholson, Shelley Duvall, and Danny Lloyd as a family who agree to look after the... I always get the wrong hotel here, the Overlook Hotel, during the winter period.
What do you call it?
I called it Outlook Hotel last time,
right, okay.
So I think I was looking at emails at the time. But look after the Overlook Hotel during the winter season to make sure everything is above board. And during the process of attempting and failing to write his book, Jack Torrance goes frightfully mad and attempts to kill his family after being egged on by the ghostly denizens of the many, 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 many ghostly denizens of this place. I think that covers it about, yeah?
Yeah, that's good. That's a good synopsis, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
So how
should we stick it
what are our feelings on this one? Vincent?
The Shining is, I think, again, a fascinating film because it rewards repeat viewings. Now, I have an interesting history with this film because I've seen it 4 or 5 times, much like 2001, actually. But each time I saw it for a while, it was consistently on a bigger screen. So the first time I saw it in the mid-90s, it was on a regular-sized television. Then I remember the time seeing it in 99 with some friends on a bigger TV. Then I saw it in a university lecture theatre, so, a larger screen. Then I saw it in a cinema, and then I saw it in a bigger screen in the cinema. So by rights, after that, I should have seen it in IMAX, but I didn't. I saw it again on a reasonably sized TV. But what is, I think, the reason I mention that is that each time I watched the film, A, I got more out of it, and B, I found it more unsettling. Now, The Shining is a film that often comes up as among the greatest or the greatest horror film or scariest moments ever. When Channel 4 did their 100 greatest scary moments back in the day, The Shining came number one. What I find interesting is that each time I've seen The Shining, I have found it scarier. It's not something where I get less unsettled by it, because each time I see it, I know what's coming. It's more a matter of, I know what's coming because, it's not that complex a story again. But again, it's the power of cinema, the pure cinematic elements of it, and have a stronger effect on me. And this is, I think, significant in terms of seeing it in the larger viewing circumstances. Firstly, because the bigger the image, the more looming it is. But also, I think this is a movie where sound plays such an important role. The soundtrack, and then the eerie sort of almost howling sound that steadily encompasses. And I think it's the reason perhaps it gets held up as this extraordinarily effective horror film is that it is an enveloping one. It is an absorbing one. And the point is, much like 2001 puts the viewer through the Stargate, The Shining entraps the viewer in the Overlook Hotel just as it does the characters. And it does this again through some very distinctive cinematic devices in terms of Kubrick's trademark long takes, and which in this case are very much used, I think, to make the space unsettling, and this booming, looming soundtrack that again gives you the sense of being, I'm trapped here, this is weird, I don't like it, let me out, while also being quite fun.
I mean, I think I've probably come at this a different way than you guys. I think that's probably to do with my age. I think I first became aware of The Shining in about mid 1980s with The Young Ones. Do you remember The Young Ones?
Yes.
TV comedy show on BBC Two. They did an episode called Video Nasty, where Alexei Sale's character takes a drug that turns him into a psychopathic axe-wielding maniac, and they riff on the whole Overlook Hotel thing in that so well, and they do the whole here's Johnny scene and bashing through the wall, but I wasn't really aware of The Shining at that point. I became aware then that had come from The Shining. Thinking about it, I think in 84 or 5 or whatever, I was 13, so I wouldn't have seen something like The Shining at that point. Probably then went out and found it as a Video Nasty. Probably wasn't a Video Nasty, but I'll have seen it after that point. But it certainly, I came at it from that angle, so I'd already seen probably some of those long shots. And the same as you guys, I suppose, saw 2001. Rob, you were saying you'd seen all these bits of it beforehand. I'd seen loads of spoofs and stuff on it before I actually saw the film itself. So yeah, but it's a scary film, and it's scary for lots of different reasons. And I agree that the book is scarier. There's a lot about the book that will scare you a lot more. But I think sometimes putting things on screen helps an awful lot. I've got my little Jack's with me here. Look, there's Jack. Just come along and say hello. But he's there. Yeah. Don't know.
Okay. See, I have a funny relationship with this. I find it less scary every time I watch it.
Yeah.
I think that's just my nature. It's just sort of processing it. I mean, the question that I had this time, there's 2 questions. One is, how does this hotel function? Because it's so haunted. It has a hall room where an entire ball is going on at some point. So I don't know how this functions, as well as all the weird little bits and pieces that you happen upon. What's in room 237? Do they hire that out? It's just all these questions run through your head. But for me, it just plays very differently, because what is the scary thing? Is it the building, or is it Jack? If it's the building, it's a terrifying movie. If it's Jack, he's kind of very ineffectual. He gets locked in a room completely. He gets completely defeated. He gets tricked by his son. So that's the question I think you have to ask. Is it the building, or is it Jack? That's the scary one.
I think it's a haunted house film, isn't it? It's about this big, sprawling, haunted house that just happens to be a hotel. And it is the building that's scary. The building is the villain in the piece. Jack is, I don't know, some sort of outstretch of the building's feelings, or the buildings want to, what is it? How do they put it somewhere? And I think it's in the book that it's to sacrifice and to get the blood that's required to sate its appetite effectively. But it is the building that is the nasty part of this. It's not Jack himself. Jack is just, I guess, possessed in a certain way by the building.
Yes, that's a good way of putting it.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. That it is. Stephen King has often said that it was that The Shining, much like Shirley Jackson's The Haunting of Hill House, it's about it's a bad place. That's what this is. It is a place where badness, where evil, if you will, kind of exists and lurks. And what's interesting is as to why this is the case. I mean, is it because it was, the old cliche, built on an Indian burial ground, or is it sort of like from like in Buffy the Vampire Slayer? Maybe it's built on a hellmouth, something like that. Just in terms of what you said before, Gav, about the parodies, at the time that I would have first encountered The Shining, I also encountered The Shinning from The Simpsons, which also makes references to here's Johnny, and being a lot more overt. And I think it's important to note that, I'd agree that the monster of The Shining is the Overlook Hotel itself. But there's an element, and Jack is like its vessel, who is, quite right, as you say, Rob, not very effective. But I think what helps make The Shining, and why I personally find it more unsettling every time I watch it, is that what this bad place is doing is it's unsettling because it is unsettled. It is uncertain. And bear in mind, most of the weird aspects of it, the supernatural aspects, we get largely from the perspective of Danny, who is, he's the one who gets the flashes of the blood pouring out of the elevators. He's the one who encounters the two little girls. He's the one who encounters something in room 237. We don't even know what. And then when Jack encounters it, it's, I think, interesting that the way he encounters it, it's somewhat different because we get to see it, what he encounters. Whereas with Danny, it's often a lot more impressionistic. And then right towards the end of the film, when Wendy is running away from Jack, there's the point when she sees there's the sudden moment, which I've heard described as the most terrifying moment of the film, is when all of a sudden there are these two party people, one of whom is in a bear suit, apparently giving oral sex to another guest. Like, what? Where did that come from? And what we have here is the sense of this entire environment is mad. It's not making sense. It's gone. You cannot trust it. You cannot trust your own perceptions. And although we've seen Jack go bonkers, and it's not really a surprise when he does it because he seems kind of bonkers from the start, I think the important journeys that we follow, it's worth noting that Jack isn't necessarily the protagonist of the film. And I think Wendy is more the character that we should, that our sympathies could attach to. There's an excellent piece written by Rebecca McCallum that's on the blog for the Evolution of Horror, talking about the way Wendy Torrance is the character to follow and to identify with. And notably, it is in the film's final act, when she is the one being threatened, that we get to fully appreciate the sheer derangement of the environment. And that is in itself a feeling that you might be going mad. And what could be more horrifying than that feeling? I'm actually going mad, and I can feel it happening. That is what I think makes The Shining profoundly frightening.
I think it's one of these rare occasions where the style of the filmmaker actually lends to that theory. Because Hitchcock, where's that coming from? Kubrick is notorious for his many takes.
Oh, yeah.
To the point where actors hated him 30, 40, 50 takes. And I can imagine doing what is entailed in this movie would send the actors feeling a little bit loopy and a little bit vulnerable, especially, which you have to bring up Wendy Torrance. History's kind of made her a punching bag. as a easy target, as a terrible, annoying, screamy, whiny character, which is unfair, really. She's a very... I mean, when you talk about horror movies, when you talk about people being killed, slashers, what have you, you talk about sort of final girl archetypes. Using that archetype, she's one of the most intelligent and thoughtful and well put together characters, because she is looking after her family and she does win, essentially. There's more to her than that, but it's just she is a much more compelling character than history has reduced her to.
Yeah, I could agree with that. I agree with everything you've just both said, actually, about this being Wendy's story rather than anyone else's. I mean, I think the book focuses it more on being Danny's story, definitely.
Okay.
Which is why I suppose Dr. Sleep works as a sequel to this, because that's continuing Danny's story and about his special gift of The Shining that the title is all about.
Yes, because that's a gift that he discovers through Scatman Crothers in a great little role.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, it's just... I think that's the only time where it actually cuts away from the hotel, isn't it? When it's him phoning up, trying to chase down, which leads to the only kill in the movie, really.
Yeah. Yes.
I always say that I remember very clearly the first time I saw The Shining, the point when Scatman Crothers' character, Dick Halloran, he literally makes the journey from Florida to Colorado, the width of the United States, and then gets the snowcat up into the mountains, and he gets into the hotel. And then out of nowhere, Jack appears swinging the axe. And I always remember the point where as you say, the only kill, Halloran is killed. And I just think, oh, right in the heart, because that's where the axe goes. I mean, Jack gets Dick right in the heart with that axe. And one of the interesting, The Shining is filled with images that have given many people all sorts of interesting interpretations, which we can talk about. But one I think that is a very effective one is that when Halloran falls dead, he falls back onto a rug with a Native American design. So what we have here is Native American image, and here is a black man image, two ethnicities who have been been oppressed, slaughtered by the white man represented in Jack. Because another way one can read the film is it is to some extent, and again, this is probably more pronounced in the novel, it is something of a display of toxic masculinity from before.
Well, that was the stance, wasn't it? Yeah. Yeah, it's Stephen King addressing his alcoholism. That was the genesis behind it being written. And I think that's maybe why he's very precious about its adaptation, because it was him basically going through therapy when writing this book, personal therapy. Maybe he's just bitter. I don't know.
Hey, what's he got to be bitter about? I'm sure he was paid handsomely.
Yeah, I bet he was, yeah. It didn't stop his book selling even more as well afterwards. So
precisely.
Well, he's wrote so many.
Yeah. Seems some sort of therapy. So
yeah, a favourite scene of mine it's not what you'd call a traditional scary scene. It's one of the instances where Jack goes to the bar for a drink. Only on this occasion, it's got a full party and full regalia all there. And it's the conversation that he has in the bathroom with the Grady character. It's just very unnerving, skin crawling, a different type of horror to the rest of the movie, where it's just oppressive. This is sort of seeing the nature of the building really through that one man, and it's just an ugly, frightening scene, I think. And it's just a conversation.
Yeah, there's a lot of elements to the film that are. I think you've touched on before, Vincent, that there's an unsettling nature to the film, and just a conversation like that can be even scarier because it's sort of unsettling, the way that he talks, the way that the whole thing pieces together. There's, the scene where we follow Danny down the corridors to see the Grady twins, is scary, even though there's actually nothing happening other than you're following a little boy on a tricycle down these corridors, and it's just so claustrophobic in the way that you're following them down there. Before he even meets the twins, there's a certain level of uncertainty to what's going on, unnervingness to what's going on. It just makes it scary. There's lots of elements to the whole film that are scary for no other reason than just they're there.
Yeah.
And quite often they are scary because they are there, but they shouldn't be. I mean, the sudden appearance of these two little girls, it's like, hang on, I thought it was just the three of us in the hotel. Where do they come from? And then we get the sudden cut to them, well, cut to pieces. And then there's the appearance, as I mentioned earlier, of when the ghosts, as it were, of the hotel start appearing, and Wendy can see them. But also Kubrick's long takes add to this because, as you said, Gav, we're following Danny on his tricycle around the hotel. And I think there's the anticipation. It's the suspense. A key part of horror is suspense. We're waiting for something to happen, even if that is a cut. And we don't get a cut. We get a continual shot. And to add to the idea of here we are in a place that is not to be trusted, that is unsettled and therefore unsettling, the geography of the overlook doesn't make sense. It's like, wait a minute, hang on. So we come into the lobby, we carry on along this corridor, and then if we turn left, we're going to come into the we're not in the kitchen. That's odd. We did earlier. And then there's the grand ballroom. Sort of lounge, rather, not the ballroom, the lounge where Jack is typing. I can tell you, if I wanted to be working on something, I wouldn't go in a room that vast. I'd get way too distracted. And can you imagine the echo of the typing? No wonder. No wonder it was all work and no play, making him a dull boy. It's
just remember another reference. Bob's Burgers is another one that's referencing this movie. So sorry. What were you saying, Vincent?
But quite often we'll see the characters walking through the different corridors and they're not consistent, which I think, again, adds to the sense of, because Kubrick has the reputation for being this massive micromanager, perfectionist who wanted everything his way, anytime there seems something which feels like a continuity error, you feel, well, it can't be a continuity error, because sometimes it's very obvious. Like the point I was talking about when Jack's in the massive sort of lounge area, he's at his desk, and then Wendy comes and distracts him, and he shows what a horrible man he is. And there's a clock, a chair in the background, and then the next shot is gone. That it's too obvious to be a continuity error. So I think it's At the same time, it's not necessarily do anything terribly profound. It's simply illustrating, yes, this place is not to be trusted.
Yes. Okay. So, any closing thoughts on The Shining?
Well, I suppose we should at least briefly discuss Room 237.
Yes.
In
the documentary.
The documentary, yes. So for those who don't know, Room 237 is a documentary about interpretations of The Shining. It's a very interesting documentary where you've got various people explaining their theories about The Shining, that it's to do with sexual repression, that it's to do with the slaughter of indigenous Americans. It's about it's about alcoholism. It's that there are only certain ways of understanding it. And then you have the shall we say, the more outlandish theories, suggesting that The Shining is Stanley Kubrick confessing to the world that he faked the Apollo moon landings.
I don't even know how you make that leap, but it's a special one, isn't it? It's a big one.
Yeah. It seems to be. It's largely grounded on the idea that that the footage of the moon landing somehow looks fake. Well, if it was fake, why is it such overtly bad quality? And then the idea is being that there are various aspects within The Shining, most prominently the point when Danny is wearing an Apollo 11 jumper, which, if you want to see something in a certain way, then you will probably see that and say, oh, there we go. That supports my theory. On the other hand, if you're not seeing it that way, then it's understandable there would be merchandise related to Apollo 11 following the moon landings. So you can explain it quite away in that. But I will say that The Shining is Room 237 is a very entertaining demonstration of the kind of responses that you can come up with in relation to film, where a drawer can represent a penis, and where the prominence of a bull's head means that this is a reference to a minotaur, and therefore also a particular form of sexuality. It's a fascinating watch, and I think testament to the continued developing power of The Shining.
Yes. So, last question. Yeah, it's pretty spot on. So, last question before we jump into some things that we've also been watching. As a director, what do you believe Stanley Kubrick's legacy is? I know you could talk about this for a long, long time. So, because you could say if it was a Mount Rushmore of directors and famous directors and accomplished and brilliant directors, he's going to be on it. But that's a very vague way of summing up his legacy and what he means to the film industry and the way films are made now.
Mm-hmm.
So, as far as what you think his place is in history beyond just the status of his movies, what do you think it is?
Do you want to start, Vincent?
Or
shall I?
I'm not sure.
Sure. Okay, the influence of Stanley Kubrick is difficult. I don't think you can underestimate it, simply because for somebody with a relatively limited filmography, as I said, I'm ashamed to say there are still some films of his I haven't seen. But to a very large extent, I think we could say for the cinema we have today, thank you, Stanley. Because his influence, and it's important to note that he was a mainstream Hollywood director. We're not talking much like Alfred Hitchcock, much like John Ford, much like Orson Welles. These were people who were, yes, they were significant creative artists. I say that, unironically. They were also major practitioners in the film industry. And what Kubrick did was he had his own distinctive style. To such an extent, you can have something like the film Get Him to the Greek, where a couple of characters very high are running along a hotel corridor, and they say, "This corridor is so long, it's Kubrickian." Kubrickian can have that sort of reference. So on the one hand, it's the kind of cultural impact where you can make that kind of casual reference, but you can also have, you can see his influence across multiple different movies. You can see it in Star Wars. You can see it in Avatar, for instance, just to pick two films 30 years apart. And 2001: A Space Odyssey is, I think, the gold standard for Hollywood science fiction. The Shining remains a gold standard in horror. And similarly, Clockwork Orange is a gold standard in dystopia, Dr. Strangelove for satire, Full Metal Jacket for war, Barry Lyndon for costume drama, Spartacus for historical epic. Everything Kubrick did was very Kubrick, and has managed to have a significant impact on cinema ever since. So I think, on the Mount Rushmore of filmmakers, it'd probably be Charlie Chaplin, Orson Welles, Alfred Hitchcock, Stanley Kubrick, because the influence in terms of filmmaking and film practice has been profoundly influenced by Kubrick's work, and so many filmmakers are either doing something like Kubrick or doing something not like Kubrick, so therefore have to be distinctively considered in that respect. Mm-hmm. So, a bit rambling, but that is what I think is the legacy of Stanley Kubrick.
Any gaps in that you can pick up from?
Do you know what? That was a very an excellent summary of Kubrick. I think the fact that you mentioned it there, the fact that there is a word Kubrickian in our sort of language when we're talking about film, says what he did for the art of cinema. The fact that any shot that looks a little bit like, I've seen that before, but is it Kubrickian sort of thing, or your long corridors and that type of thing. His filmography is a fantastic filmography if you look through it. And it's so sprawling in the different genres that he's touched on, the different types of film that he's done. And considering that it's only, 13 films he made? Is it 13?
13 films and 3 short documentaries.
3 shorts, yeah.
It's 13 features.
It's nothing, really.
Yes.
Yeah. But it covers everything, as you say. He covers from science fiction through war, through costume drama, through parodies. And there's something through all of his films that when you do watch them, you see that there's that Kubrick feel to it. And I think his lasting effect is the same as I think many other directors that I think you've touched on in this podcast. They get copied.
Yes.
And they will be satired, or they will be used again. The way they do their shots are used by other well-known directors to show that, I know a little about film. Look, I've done something Kubrickian here. Almost that type of thing appears in film. So his lasting effect is his the way he's being copied or duplicated in the films that are still being made today.
Two very good answers. Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Well, we do our best.
I know what you are, Cat. You're a Hell Maiden. But it has to be our secret. That's how I can protect you.
Protect me from what?
Your demons.
Whoa! I'm having a vision! A green-headed girl. She seems so real. Greetings. We are the magician morticians, the artistes of the afterlife. So, as your masters, we order you to turn around and,
You're tripping.
All right. Cat's demons are raising an army of the dead.
Ding dong! Gotcha!
My demon's my problem.
That brings us to the final part of the show where we talk about some other stuff that we've been watching that maybe isn't related to Stanley Kubrick. It might be TV even. I'm quite liberal with what you've been watching. This is not one of these movie podcasts which thinks, TV is the enemy. It's a estranged relationship, a sort of distant friend at best.
Do you know what? I think TV is taking cinema and going, do you know what, cinema? You're doing it wrong. Let's do it this way. I've been watching a lot of TV recently. That's where most of my watching has been at the moment. I am really enjoying the new series Handmaid's Tale. And if you've not watched any of the other ones, you need to get into it. It's unbelievable series. And the way they're taking the stories now are just fantastic. It's only just started back up again, but it's well worth a watch as Handmaid's Tale. If you haven't seen it.
Season 5, isn't it?
Season 5 now, yeah. It's on Sunday nights, but it's on Channel 4 Sunday nights. If you don't want the adverts, watch it on Amazon, because it airs all day on a Sunday as well, without the adverts, so much better that way. Because obviously it's owned by Amazon, because Hulu are owned by Amazon now, so you can watch it all there now. So all the other series are on Amazon as well. Advertising Amazon here, please. Give me some free stuff. Handmaid's Tale, it's awesome. I would advise anyone to pick up on that. I've been watching a lot of TV, like I say, The Watcher on Netflix. Unbelievable series. Really well worth it. Got a nice spooky feel to that if you like a bit of a spooky psychological horror. So yeah, that's a good one as well. A lot of good stuff out there on TV, actually. I could list more, but I won't.
Well, you can if you want. But,
I will.
Go on, then.
By all means.
I've been watching quite a few Netflix shows lately myself. I finished, there's a connection here. We mentioned earlier Dr. Sleep, directed by Mike Flanagan. And Mike Flanagan's got a pretty good pedigree in limited series on Netflix. And I've just finished his most recent one, The Midnight Club, which is another very interesting kind of bad place tale. Yeah, 10 episodes.
That's on my watch list.
Yeah, 10 episodes. It's sometimes pretty scary. It's often very moving. The final episode, did have me in tears. So it's that's a strong one. I've also been working my way through Guillermo del Toro's Cabinet of Curiosities. So those have been some.
That bit, yes.
Yeah, those are some lovely self-contained short films, I think, as part of this series. And I've had a very, just in the month of November so far, I've had a quite diverse range of movie viewing, having watched Blade 2, Dear Zoe, Schindler's List, Black Adam, 1941, Black Panther, Wakanda Forever, The Mist, and just this morning, Death Becomes Her. I like to have a varied cinematic intake diet. Yeah.
That's getting close to mine, to be honest, because with my podcast I watch some odd films or odd different films. I've had so far. So Inception, then I did Heat with yourself, Vincent, and then I've had Everything Everywhere All at Once, The Goonies, unbelievably, and Terminator 2. So my viewing has been quite interesting for November as well.
Cool.
I can't match, but just to pick up on Cabinet of Curiosities, I finally finished that series, the final 3.
All right.
Which is where are we? It's The Murmuring is the last one, which is done by Jennifer Kent, who did The Babadook, which is a very, very moving episode. I'm not going into the how and the why of why it's moving, but it's about watching birds. I can't remember the breed and the star. Like, I actually think it's starlings. The clouds that they're flying and studying them, and there's a sad story twined in that. Yes. What was the one after it? Dreams in the Witch House is a very, very silly one, starring, I don't know what he's called now, Ron Weasley from Harry Potter.
Oh, Rupert Grint.
Yes, that's the fella. Yeah, it's got a plot beat involving a rat with a human face, and I think that's just when a horror movie or project kind of jumps the shark a little bit. And one was Panos Cosmatos as The Viewing, and I really don't understand Panos Cosmatos. I know people love him. He did Mandy and Beyond the Black Rainbow, I think it was called. I just don't get him, I'll be perfectly honest. And staying with Netflix, I watched the new Henry Selick movie, Wendell and Wild.
I haven't watched that yet, but yeah.
It's always nice to see Henry Selick getting work, because he's one of the sort of the bastions of stop animation or clay animation, whatever phrase you want to do it. And it's got Key and Peele reuniting in it, so it's just genuinely a nice little bit of a Nightmare Before Christmas style, kiddie-friendly animated horror.
I hope that Henry Selick is on your list and you'll have an episode on him one day.
I believe he should be. If not, I'll be amended very much straight away. Henry Selick is fantastic. That's Coraline, James and the Giant Peach. Fantastic filmography. But yeah, I think that about covers us for this week. Gav, where can we find you and your work online?
You can find me at the My Favourite Film podcast. Go to the website, which is very simple. It's www.myfavoritefilm.com. And all of the episodes are up there, including a lovely Halloween episode featuring Mr. Gain there. Or Dr. Gain, sorry, I apologise. Doctor, I forgot Doctor. And coming very soon, another one with you where we look at Heat. But yeah, new episodes coming regular soon.
That's okay. And Vincent, yourself?
Well, you can listen to me babbling about movies more on Invasion of the Pody People, which is on the feed for Not Just for Kids. And you can also find me across the social medias, on Twitter, for now anyway, Instagram and Letterboxd at Dr. Gain. That's DRGAINE, where I post links to my various reviews, including some on The Geek Show.
Yes, indeed. And that's it for this week of Directors and Cut. We will see you in the next one with Na Hong Jin.